Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Jennifer Pay. I am the project manager for voter service and education for the League of Women Voters of California. Thank you for joining us today. And our co-trainer today is going to be Whitney. If you want to go ahead and introduce yourself as well.
Hi there, I'm Whitney Quisenberry from the Center for Civic Design with Drew Davies from Oxide and my co-director, Dana Chisnell. We did the research behind the manual.
Great. Thanks, Whitney. So I want to thank you again and welcome everyone to the last webinar of our series of 4. We're quite excited to not only have done this great research and produced this manual, but also to provide these webinars to provide some technical assistance to all of you. Also, we're quite excited to announce here at the League that we just celebrated our 95th birthday, and throughout our history and starting out with the movement for suffrage, we've continued to advocate for voting rights. And so while we've been doing this work, we recognize and acknowledge that accessible and quality voter information is important. And we understand the challenges that many community groups and election officials have to produce the voter information in these voter guides. And we've been lucky to be able to partner with many registrars in California for the last several decades. But looking at the last election in November 2014, I don't know if you know this, but we have heard that only 31% of eligible Californians voted. And unfortunately, young people and people of color continue to be underrepresented. So although many factors contribute to low voter turnout, we believe that voter information is an important tool to engage and expand the electorate. And so we've joined forces with some amazing partners, just like the Center for Civic Design. We did research together and which was informed by many diverse stakeholders. Those folks included election officials, community organizations, good government groups, and frequent and potential voters. So those folks are at the heart of the research. We also worked with the Future of California Elections, which is also made up of election officials, civil rights organizations, and election reform advocates. And then finally, with the generous support of the James Irvine Foundation, we were able to do all this great work. So to help make voter information more effective, more inviting, and more useful, we produced this manual, this best practices manual for official voter information guides, to be an easy-to-use resource for election officials and community groups to educate California's voters and potential voters. Now, some of the recommendations in the manual are already being implemented in many of the counties and are simple fixes. But unfortunately, some may be quite challenging due to regulatory, legislative, and financial barriers. Unfortunately, not all of us are rolling in money to be able to do everything that we need to do to get done. So we invite you to share this information with us if you run into any of these challenges. We are invested for the long term and want to break down these barriers and figure out what we can do to help make voter information more accessible to voters. And we hope that this manual, as well as these webinars, will be useful to you, because we understand that, to raise voter confidence and increase participation, we have to learn how voters get information. And we want to be able to encourage all of you to implement some of the best practices for these voter guides and the recommendations that we're providing. So we hope you have a great experience. Once again, encourage you to contact us. We want to be a resource to you. All of these webinars are being recorded and will be uploaded on cavotes.org. And so we're so excited to see so many people participating in this series. And this particular webinar, we're going to go ahead and jump into the final big theme of the research. We're going to be talking about plain language. So what are the principles of plain language? And what does that include as far as how to present the information at the right level of detail? And then, of course, how do we organize this information in an easy-to-follow path? So with that introduction, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Whitney to give us the first set of recommendations.
Well, I know that we all aim for plain language and clear communication, but I want to start with a little bit of a definition, because there actually is an international definition of plain language. There are national plain language associations around the world, and my mentor, Dr. Jenny Reddish, wrote this definition, which is that information is in plain language if it helps people find what they need, understand what they find, and use it to complete their tasks, which in this case would be actually voting or participating in elections. And one of the big, most important principles is that plain language speaks to the readers using words they understand. Now, I love this definition because it gets beyond grammar, right? It says that plain language isn't just about commas and the words we use and how we write our sentences. But it's actually about the bigger goal, which I think everybody on this call probably shares, which is trying to help get information to people that they need so that they can vote. And with that definition, it sort of helps us keep the voters in mind as we work and write. I guess I want to say one other thing about plain language before we dive in a little bit further, and that is that there's nothing natural about how we write in any way. Writing is a function of habit and how we think about putting pages together. And so what we're going to be talking about today is about information systems like voter guides, whether they're online or in print. They're not about sitting down and curling up with a good novel. They're about chunks of information that people need to be able to find. They might need all of the information in the guide. They might need a little bit. So it's important that finding it is the first step of plain language, because if you can't even find the information, then it doesn't matter how well it's written. The other reason why plain language is so important, besides all of the things it does in helping sort of bridge civic literacy gaps by putting information into a form people can use, is that it helps a really large number of people. There are lots of people who don't read English well for a lot of reasons. They may not read English well. They may not read well at all. The pull quote here is that 44% of Americans, that's adults, read at basic or below basic level, according to the National Assessment of Adult Literacy. That's a decennial federal survey of literacy in the U.S. That means they can read, but they may not be able to read complicated sentences or things with complicated words in them. And most importantly, it's difficult for people who don't read well to sort through the words to understand the inferences and the information, the sort of hidden information behind the words. So a lot of what we do in plain language in things like voter guides is try to make the implications clear. Here's what you do, here's why you do it, here's the impact of what happens. Another group of people, of course, are people who may not read well because they have various forms of cognitive disabilities. And one of the interesting forms of people who don't read well are people who have visual disabilities that show up in reading. So things like having enough spacing between the lines helps people track visually. Having good contrast helps people who might have low vision. Making the text large enough means that it's easier to see, and therefore less of your brain power is going to just seeing the letter shapes, and more of it can go into reading the words. And of course, there are people who have low literacy because they don't read well, as opposed to because they can't read well. And finally, I think this is critical for voter guides. Plain language is useful because it's easier to translate. A lot of the things that the good principles of plain language advise you to do are to untangle sentences, to keep sentences short. And when you have short, positive, well-structured sentences, they translate better into other languages. There are things like passive voice that just don't show up in other languages very well, or that sort of hypothetical would, if you were to, does not translate well into many Asian languages. So it's much easier to translate, and it's also therefore much easier for people who are reading English as a second language to read those plain language. The basic principles of plain language are, well, they're pretty plain. Keep it all short. Write in short sentences. Use short, simple, everyday words. Now, of course, there may be election words that need to be defined or translated from electionese to everyday. So that doesn't mean we don't ever use those words. We just make sure that people understand them. We write in active, positive messages. So we tell people what to do rather than telling them what not to do. We write in active voice, which means that there's a subject, an action, and an object. So who does what, as opposed to it was done by somebody. Because when we can be clear about who is supposed to do something, then voters will understand that they are supposed to do it. We also keep paragraphs short, so not just short words, but short sentences, but also short paragraphs, and separating them on the page so it stands out, so each one stands out. One of the reasons for that is that people who don't read well have a behavior that we see a lot in research and has been confirmed in other research, which is that if you get lost in the paragraph, what you tend to do is to skip to the next paragraph. And that information you haven't quite gotten to gets lost. So if we have a paragraph with two thoughts in it, break it up into two paragraphs, more likely to get read. Again, we're not talking about long sustained reading, and we've talked about using text that's just plain large enough. One of the things that's really important to do is to write directly to readers. You can use the word you. And in fact, the example that we start with, it's a block paragraph about voting early. Tells you that the registrar of voters office is when it's open and so on. But if we untangle that sentence, we can change it to vote early in person. This is a imperative sentence. There's no subject in it, but the implicit subject is you. So you can vote early in person. Where can you vote early? At the registrar's office. What are the dates? You notice it doesn't say for a week before election. It's got the actual dates, and it's got the times, and it's even used a little bit of typography bolding to make those vote early in person and the dates and times stand out, followed by the address of the registrar's office. So all of this is an example of a lot of the plain language principles: short sentences, easy words broken up into in paragraph chunks, and using a little bit of typography like bolding to help make the key points jump off the page. A second thing that's helpful to do is to write the headings as either questions or active instructions. So if we want to, maybe we have a page that's about deadlines for when we can request a vote by mail ballot. We could have a page that the section could just be titled Deadlines or Vote by Mail Deadlines, which is kind of a big string of nouns. But we could make it more active by either using it as a question. What is the last day to request a vote by mail ballot? Or we could use a quasi-question, that is, it uses the interrogative word how, so we have how to request a vote by mail ballot. Both of these two suggest questions that people might ask. One of the things we heard in the research was that a lot of people who did not vote regularly or had not voted before didn't really know what questions they had. They knew that they weren't sure what to do. They knew that they wanted information, but they didn't even quite know enough to formulate a series of questions, and certainly maybe not on the spot in a research session. So when you have a heading that's either a question or quasi-question, what we found was that people look at it and they go, oh yes, I need that information, right? So it helps them formulate the questions that they are swimming around in that incoherent soup and make them coherent. And when they do have a question that's firm in their head, when they see those words on the page, it makes them think, yeah, right, I've got it. You know, they understood what I wanted to know, and they gave it back to me as an answer. When the information is short, you can also just put the instruction, you can put all the information in the heading. So the heading might say, request a vote by mail ballot by October 29th, and then go on to explain how and when and where to do it. So that if someone's just looking for the deadline, that deadline is in the thing, and even if they're just starting the process, they immediately know that there's a deadline associated with it. They have to do it by a certain date before they start in to work through the steps for how to actually request that ballot. As I said, one of the things that using questions does is it helps embed, it makes the guide into a series of answers to those questions. And in a way, the structure sort of embeds civic education as it answers that question. In all of the research we've done, both the research for this work and some previous work we did on online voter guides and election websites, by far the top questions that people had were about what's on the ballot. But they may not ask the question that way. I mean, they might, but they ask questions like, who do I support or vote for? Who's running? Who will I be voting for? Who are the candidates? What are the ballot measures? What are the pros and cons? How does this measure meet a tax increase? Those are all, they get more specific as we go down that list, but all of them are really questions that add up to wanting to know more information about what's on the ballot and the details about what's on the ballot. Interestingly, when we during the research in the first round with 45 participants, 9 of them had no questions at all when they started, but as they began to read the guide, questions started to come up because they learned a little bit or it reminded them of the election context, and they would say, "Oh, that's right. I'm going to have to go to a polling place. I don't remember where my polling place was. Where do I go to vote?" Or I know that they're open in the evening, but how late are they open? What times are the polls open until? So that each piece of information they get triggers more questions. And so by providing a table of contents or a series of headers with those questions, it helps people not only ask the right questions, but get to the right answers. Another bit of plain language is obviously the vast number of words that we use in elections, partly for long-time habit, they're just election terminology, but also because they come up in new legislation or because they kind of sound formal. So some of the words that people were confused by, top two primary, it wasn't just that they didn't know what the top two primary was, they often didn't know what a primary was. But even the word endorsement, what does that mean in this context? What's a partisan contest? The word contest itself was confusing. They thought, is that like a drawing or a raffle? But partisan, that word was completely unfamiliar to them. Splitting your vote, one person pronounced the next word rebuttal, and they're looking at pros and cons of measures. And when we changed that heading to just say, argument in favor of this measure, reply to that argument, that made a lot more sense. Redistricting, if you don't know that you're in an election district, then you don't know what redistricting is. And again, we may have to use these words, but we might want to make sure that we've wrapped the definition into the sentence so that if the heading starts out and talks about redistricting, we can talk about how there's a legislative process to organize people into districts, and the process, and every few years we redo that, and that process is called redistricting, and so on. And I just want to give you an example of a situation in which something that sounds like plain language was actually quite difficult for people. So many of the voter guides that we looked at, and certainly the one that we created as a prototype to work with, has the difference. What's the difference between, we had 3 ways to vote: vote by mail, early voting, and vote at the polls. And some people actually thought this was a process. One rather young voter who I think might have voted once but may not have voted yet said, well, I get this booklet in the mail, and so that must mean that I'm a vote-by-mail voter, right? Because they weren't clear about the difference between the voter information pamphlet and sample ballot and the actual ballot they would vote on. They knew that they just read that there were instructions about returning your vote by mail ballot early. So they thought, well, that's the early part of it. So vote by mail, it comes in the mail. Then I have to do this early voting thing. So I have to get my ballot back early. And then they saw that you could drop it off at the polling place. So that must be the polls. We found that a very few word change made a big difference. So vote by mail, vote early in person, vote at the polls in person. And I think this could even be improved by saying vote at the polling place in person, because polls is hard, but polling place suggests that it's the place you go. Maybe we even might want to change that word to voting place, but that little bit of a second word would help make it clear that these are a choice, and adding the heading 3 ways to vote made it clear that this is a choice of 3 options rather than a sequence of instructions. So none of these words are hard words except possibly polls. They would certainly all pass, the 8th grade reading test, and yet one way of writing this page confused some people, and the other, and a few changes helped it. So this is a good example of thinking about the words we use, how the audience, how the voters that we're writing for understand those words, and trying to put them all together so that it helps voters do what they need to do, which is figure out how to vote and successfully go through that process. So that's the basics of plain language. And I want to just take a brief pause and see if there's any questions before I hand it over to Jen and to go on to the next section. Well, I don't see anything, so why don't we just keep going, Jen?
So Whitney provided an overview about plain language and what it is, and we want to echo this and how that information also gets organized, and how can we create a path that this information can be digested in a way that's easy for people to understand and walk away with, and once again feel confident going into election day. So the first thing that we want to point out is this table of contents. What we found really fascinating was during the voter interviews, the potential voter interviews, this was the one piece of information folks continued to go back to. People wanted to see not only what was in the guide and an overview of what's in the guide, and this was across the board. So for those frequent voters, they can see right away, oh, this is where I can find information about the ballot measures and the candidates. I need to jump right there. For those infrequent and potential voters, they needed more information about the logistics of voting. So they got a little bit more background about how to find that information. And this roadmap was a great tool for folks, once again, to go back and forth after reading a section and seeing what else they needed to learn more about to be prepared for the election. It also helps clearly separate, once again, the basics of voting versus what is actually going to be in your ballot, and helping to anticipate the questions and the answers that voters need to be prepared to go in and vote. The second tool we want to emphasize is the difference between the county and the state voter guide. This touches upon some of those civic literacy gaps, but for some folks, for many, it was really confusing that they would receive two guides. Why isn't everything in one guide? And if they only referred to one, they may have thought, oh, I don't need this other one, not realizing that they're intertwined and connected. So we would encourage some sort of reference, once again in plain language, between the county guide and the state voter guide, so to help voters understand how they work together and recognize them when they arrive, so they can beat that 20-second test that we talked about before, making it past the mailbox and into their home and opened. The next tool that we recommend is organizing information by activity or task. This is incredibly important when thinking about how the information is organized on a page and encouraging one topic per page. So similarly, as Winnie pointed out, if there are multiple subjects in one paragraph, sometimes it can get missed and looked over. The same could be said for how these pages were organized as well. So for example, when we had a table of contents in one of the prototype voter guides, we had key contact information of that sample voter registrar's office, and that got missed. So folks had questions on who to contact. They didn't really know where because they didn't realize it was on the page of the table of contents. So we all know that there are space limitations and financial limitations in thinking about how you want to be creative and how you use your pages, but we would definitely encourage you to find a way to create, the information so that it's packaged one topic per page. Another reason why plain language is a theme that we want to emphasize is that with plain language, you're hopefully coming up with shorter sentences, more direct and easy words to use, and so hopefully the content and the copy ends up becoming smaller to fit on one page. Now, when organizing those pages, it's important to think about how the layout is going to look different from each other depending on that topic area. So, for example, here you see the accessibility and language voting assistance page, so all that background about all the available resources that you may have if you're limited English proficient. And on the flip side, once again, comparing between the state and county guides, what actually is in those guides. So imagine you get the voter guide in your hands and you're skimming through. Whether you're a frequent voter, infrequent, or potential voter, you're literally skimming through to see what may catch your attention. And if the page layout is a little different from topic to topic, it helps differentiate for voters what information they're consuming. Similarly, when you're thinking about ballot measures versus candidates, this is another helpful tool that organizes the information between between that content, because it's a lot to digest. Who's actually running for office and the candidates and the candidate information that they're providing and then also the ballot measures and how you're breaking up the ballot measures as well. We know that it is incredibly challenging knowing the limitations that you have in the ballot measure language and even in candidate information that gets provided, if that is in plain language. But we're hoping that with some flexibility, as well as thinking through, once again, those barriers that you're all facing, what we can do legislatively or administratively and even financially, if there's some financial costs, how we can simplify the way not only that we use plain language, but how that information then gets organized in specific sections and then again in the guide. At this point, we're opening it up again for questions, and I'm not seeing any in the chat box. I'm looking to see.
I want to add one more thing while Jen is looking. We spent a lot of time debating and looking at how current guides have organized the paid candidate statements and the details on the local ballot measure. And one of the things that we suggest is that we think both will work, but to be consistent about it, that you might start with an overview of who's running for office, followed by an overview of the local ballot measures. Then dive into the detail for the paid candidate statements and all of the for and against arguments and the full text of the ballot measures if you're including those in the guide. One of the reasons for that is that we know that people do get tired and get sort of lost especially when it's a fairly long measure. And so being able to help them flip through quickly and just see, well, in this guide we have 2 or 3 or maybe 4 local measures and a few candidates that are covered in the local guide, and then go into the detail. I'll talk a little bit more about overview and details in a minute. I guess we don't have any questions yet, so we'll just keep going. So this is all about sort of levels of detail, and I'm afraid I'm going to have to jump out of order in a minute, but we've said this, I think, in every guide, which is to maximize the value of the front cover. Because if we think about the 10-second view, that's the front cover of the guide. And if we can include as much information there at a very, very brief and summary level, so that people, if all they do is look at that, then they will get to see this. Now, one of the things we call this is kind of bite, snack, and meal. So if you look at, if you think of the cover as the bite, then maybe a single page that talks about the 3 ways to vote or the 4 ways to vote might be the snack. Again, if you don't know, if you already know a little bit about what vote by mail is like, then you get enough information because it reminds you of the deadlines, it reminds you of where you can turn it on, where you can return your ballots, and when they have to be returned. And then the meal is that page that we saw before with everything about it. Now, not every topic needs a full meal, but if you think about the cover or the table of contents as the bite, the briefest summary is the snack, and then everything is the meal. There's an official word for this, which is progressive disclosure. And what it really means is that we always want to have lots of information. I mean, there are so many ifs in elections. If you've lived in the state for long enough, if you have been in jail, if you are a new citizen, what do you have to do? And we tend to kind of dump all the information in the very first page. But if we can ease people into it and only let them go to the deeper page or the deeper, more extensive information if they need that information, by providing nice pointers. So we can say, if there's more details, see page 4, and at page 4 we can then go into all the details and we can help carry it through. So just to put those examples in a thing you can see that the amount of text changes and the presentation of it might change. So you can think about what information do people need, what's the absolute minimum information you can give them, and so on. One of the ways to think about what goes in the bite, what goes in the snack, and what goes in the meal is to think about the kinds of questions you get on the phone, or that people come into the office to ask, but probably more likely email or phone, right? And try to make sure that if you think about the vast number of questions, if it's simple information that people are calling to ask, maybe that's information that needs to be moved up front. And to make sure we don't overload the bites and the snacks, make sure that we're not including information that isn't so needed, so that we can be very clear about what the level of detail that we're providing at any given moment. The next thing when we talk about the right information, I think, is a little bit radical in terms of making changes in current voter guides. We got the idea for this layout from the Oakland Easy Voter Guide, which had this very nice presentation of the candidates with their picture at the top of the column and some information that they'd provided in a kind of structured format. And we knew that people reacted very positively to it, and we knew that they reacted very positively to the pictures. But when we retested and laid out a prototype of it, we took the pictures off. For one thing, we know that this is a controversial issue, and I think that it needs a little more research than just one project. And I think there's some big production and technical issues in trying to include photographs in any event. What we came up with is something that we think would be a really great idea to include in guides when it can be done. And that is that we have not only the title of the office that they're running for, but a very brief description of that office, because people, especially at the local level, don't always know the difference between their assembly district and their board of supervisors, for example. We also think that the structured information helps. I have to say that if you had asked me before this project about having all capital letters turned sideways on the page, I would have told you that it was a terrible idea and that we absolutely shouldn't do it. But it actually tested pretty well, so we're holding out our opinion on this until we see how it plays out in real thing. But we think it works on the side because it's kind of obvious what the information is, and it just provides it's like tabs on the page as opposed to like headings. So we have some basic information. Who is this person in this particular ballot? They provide their current job. They are allowed to provide some contact information. And then obviously they've been asked for a couple of very short personal statements for their top priorities. And then we end the column with, if they have a paid candidate statement, a link to the page where their candidate statement goes. When people saw this, they really liked the structured information. They wanted to know that it was written by the candidate, not written about the candidate. But they liked that they could easily compare candidates for an office. They liked that it was short. Many people said this was enough information for them. But others said it's a good start at the information. Now, clearly, if you're not collecting this information now, then adding something like this would be a lot of work. But maybe even just lining up the top of this, that is the candidates for the office and who they are and how to contact them for more information, just that much information might be quite useful. Because we heard from a lot of people that they just wanted to know more about the candidates. That helps them compare them and helps them make their choices, and not just by ticking off a party. They really wanted to know a little bit about them, and they wanted it in a form that's easy to scan. So we've got a civic literacy thing going on here, but combined with not only short bites of content, but how it's laid out, all wrapped up together to be kind of a plain language package. And similarly with measures, if we can break it up into structured information and that structure is repeated measure after measure after measure, then people will get used to seeing it that way, and it will help them learn to begin to research their position on the measures by using information that's already available in many cases on local measures. When in our prototype guide, we actually prototyped up both the simple structured things and longer information, and we asked voters very specifically about both the candidates and the measures what parts of the information they wanted to have included in their voter guide, no matter what anybody else might want. What did they want in their voter guide? And what they said, not surprisingly, was that they wanted shorter information. They wanted easier to scan information. And they said, I think, the things we might expect them to say. It's simpler, takes too much time to read. They want to focus on priorities. They want less words, my favorite was less words but more information per page. They liked the structured layout because it was easier for them to scan, and it wasn't so much blocks of text. We call those walls of words. So this didn't seem like much of a surprise that people would look at something that looked like like fewer words on the page and structured information and would think that's great. What we were a little bit surprised at was that people also said they wanted more information available, even if they didn't think they'll know if they would read it. They liked that there was a summary, um, but they also know that sometimes they want to have the option of reading more. If this is a measure that they care about, and they can read that summary to learn why it's worth caring, then they might be interested in going further. They also, we heard from people who, especially people who hadn't voted very often, that they didn't want to feel that the information was hidden from them. We did ask them about having it online, and we got mixed responses on that. Some people said, it's not so available. Not everybody has web. Some people said that would be okay as long as it's very clear and it's not just a general go online and read it, but click here exactly to this link, a nice short easy link to get exactly to the page that has the information. So if it's a direct link as opposed to go online and find it yourself. But some of the more avid voters said that they liked being able to have the full text so they could actually go read it and see whether the arguments in the for and against made sense. But they all said, you know what, you could put that in the back. You could get me through the summary first, and then if I want to read more, I'll go read more. One person even said, can't you make it a different color pages so we know that's all the fine print stuff. So I think we have a kind of mixed message here. And I think we have some plain language and design challenges to try to resolve them, which is a desire for short, concise information and a desire to make sure that they're not that information isn't being left out or hidden from them in any way. And our solution to that is the summary pages followed by the detail pages. You could organize the book so it goes summary, detail, summary, detail, summary, detail. And trust that the difference in the display and the way the pages look would help people pick up quickly that they're moving from, say, measure E to measure F, or from one group of candidates to another group of candidates. But I think we could also do it in this kind of all summaries followed by all measures. And maybe it would, if you have just one measure in a particular election, that would make a difference as well. So I know that it probably sounds like we've strayed a lot from the topic of plain language if we think about it as just how we write the information. But for me, plain language kind of ties it all together. It's how we choose what to write, how we choose to write it, how we organize it, and how we put it in the book or on the page if you're not doing a full book. And the nice thing is that if you are doing inserts, someone in the last session asked about inserts rather than doing a full bound booklet, you could have an insert for the ballot measures that would be all the summaries followed by all the detail, or all the summaries followed by the link for how to find the information online if they want to read the full measure of the bill. So that brings us to the end of this material and time for more questions. And it must be Friday afternoon because I see everybody's very quiet.
I do want to add one other thing. So as Whitney pointed out, there's an array of opinions, especially if you're a frequent voter versus someone who has never voted before. But uniformly, people do want information in a way that's easy to understand. For example, someone that we interviewed, who was a speaker who hadn't yet voted before, she saw a sample voter guide in their prototype and was looking through, and was like, it looks like a novel. It should just be 3 pages. And then on the flip side, when we had interviewed someone who just became recently naturalized, it definitely emphasized that she was looking at both the English and the Chinese version, and she greatly appreciated that there was a voter guide in Chinese, but for her, if the translations are bad, it just makes her angry. So these principles of plain language apply not only for the English, especially for those folks who may be adult literacy students, But for those who have limited English proficiency, we all recognize that with plain language incorporated, your translations actually end up coming out better and easier, especially for those complicated election words and jargon that we may use, to the actual process of voting, um, to the candidate statements and ballot measures or any background information that is shared. When we incorporate principles of plain language, we also help those communities that may may be limited English proficient, but also those who may not be reading at a higher grade level. So, this is definitely a practice that we encourage, not only for the state and for the counties, but we're also trying to find ways to put the pressure on in the capital as well. So we're excited to see that this conversation is actually happening right now. Um,
And
so we're gearing up for some recommendations that are already being talked about on the legislative side, which is great.
And I just want to say one more thing. Allison sent me a note that said we're speaking in plain language, and that's great. It took me a while to learn to sort of get my plain writing legs, right? I think it's partly a trick of just learning to do it, learning to write in that style. I get asked a lot, how do we take information that may not be as plain language and make it plain language? And I think part of the answer is that you get there incrementally. That is, you might go through it and first just, think about taking the text you have and thinking about how to present it. Are there things that you can put into lists? Are there things that you can break up the paragraphs? And then once you've got those paragraphs broken up and that text organized, you can then begin to think about, can we say it more clearly? Can we shorten, can we use simpler words, or can we untangle complicated sentence structures to make sure that the key information comes early in the sentence, and that they're an active voice? And sometimes when you do that, you find that you've said the same thing twice, or that you've missed saying something entirely, and it just helps you go through it. I don't mean that it has to be incremental voter guides from year to year, but even just in one editing session. It's a little like peeling away an onion with all the different layers of things. And once you've got that style going in your office, then you can just keep it going, because you can see from election to election if it's working, and continue to refine it as you go along, because one of the great things about working in elections is there's always another one.
Another recommendation that I want to speak to. So here at the League, for many of you may be familiar with the Easy Voter Guide, which we've been doing for many years. We're fortunate, and actually some community groups do this as well. You'll take official election language, go through a process by which it gets reviewed and vetted. So for us, what we end up doing is we take that information from the Legislative Analyst's Office. We meet with our adult literacy program partners with the state libraries, and that gets talked through and fleshed out and vetted. And then once that's done and written in English, we get it all translated, and all the translations also then get vetted and reviewed. Obviously we have a little bit more flexibility because we're not an official government agency, but our hope is that for some counties, actually they already do this, and we're hoping that many more will also incorporate this in their work, to have some sort of committee, an advisory committee, to help vet through the language that you do have control over, that can be written more in plain language. And especially for that evergreen content that gets used election after election, want to make sure that that is reviewed and tested for those everyday folks who will have access to it. And so that's something that I would also encourage.
Okay, well, to take us out, this is the last of the webinars. We've done 4 of them, and they will all be archived online so that you can go replay them. The first one is already online. The second one we're still working on. We had a little bit of video problem with it, and we'll have these online, hopefully, these last 2, hopefully, middle of next week. If you don't...
and if you also notice, if you've been able to join us in all 4, there's obviously some overlap, but we definitely encourage you, your staff, your partners to check out each of the webinars, the first being the full overview, and then the following 3 covering the themes that we're recommending. And all of that is what you pointed here in the slide is in the manual itself. So you can access it online. You can download the full manual. If you do need hard copies, please contact us, and we'll do our best to get you a copy as well. And coming out of the manual, one other checklist or one other tool that we want to encourage you all to use is this checklist. It's a great tool because it gives the entire list of recommendations that we're encouraging for your voter guides. So it's helpful when creating or revising your voter guides, what you want to address, what you want to change, what you may want to revise, and then also what you're already doing, which is pretty exciting itself. And then in addition to the manual, we've got all this great information at the Center for Civic Design website. We have the full report that they pulled together based off of the research. The research information includes sample voter guide pages, the icons and illustrations coming out of the prototype voter guide, and a full bank of the 2014 primary election voter guides, which was part of our landscape analysis. And then the research protocol materials, such as the sample pages and prototypes that were tested. So check out the Center for Civic Design website as well. And all of our websites are listed here, so you can find a way to contact us. Please keep in touch. We want to continue the conversation and not only find ways to see what can be done in the upcoming year, knowing that 2016, the elections are going to be pretty big. But going forward, what are those barriers that we want to address, make the necessary changes, and once again, continue to improve voter information and voter guides so that voters across the state will have the information that they need to feel confident going into Election Day. So thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to keeping in touch and continuing to work together. Have a wonderful weekend.